Okay, so first of all, thank you for being able to be here. For those who can be here tonight, those who can't, you see this on video. One thing I don't think I've said in all the years I've been putting these videos up on YouTube, for those of you who want, so you don't have to go searching for the video each week that I repost in our groups. You can subscribe. Let's say subscribe. I don't know what you're supposed to do, but subscribe, and you'll automatically get a notification that I posted something new. Usually once I posted it, I pretty much share the link almost right away. Plus, I also finally got around to putting them all into groupings. So like all the Kusari classes and all the Navi classes and Pirkei Avot, it's all segregated by groups now. It's called playlists. So it was fairly simple to do. Even I figured it out. So feel free to always go in there and see some old classes if you want. Let me tell you what we're going to do tonight. I'm going to finish we started last week and going this week and continue with a brief biography of Ben Gurion and going to intersperse it tonight with 3 brief videos. You'll see why. We're at the point in history where some of the things, and we're going to go back a little bit, but some of the things that we'll talk about tonight regarding Ben Gurion, we actually can see video of certain events, not of Ben Gurion. We're going to do that at a different time. But tonight, just things that happened concurrently with his coming to his position of power. Let's just use that word. It's kind of a loose way right now. So we left off. I gave a general overview last time about Ben Gurion. I'm going to go back a little bit now to where we left off. We're in 1912. He travels to Constantinople, which of course eventually becomes Istanbul. He goes there to study law. He wants to learn law because he felt that if he were to learn law in Istanbul, then Constantinople, i.e., Turkey, it would help him because at that time the Ottoman Empire ruled Israel, although it wasn't yet called Israel. He felt that the Zionist enterprise, the Zionist movement would be assisted by him knowing the Turkish law as well. So he'd have an insight into the country. He also spent some time in Salonika, which was a very large Jewish Sephardic center. He learned Spanish while he was there to connect with the Ladino-speaking Jewish community. If you're not familiar with Ladino sounds like an SAT question. Ladino is to Spanish like Yiddish is to German. So it is a language that the Jews took on that was similar to their host country's language with an influence of Hebrew and other Semitic language. There are many families, Sephardic families, that still use, especially at the Seder and maybe Shabbatot and other events, will use Ladino in their tefillot, in their Seder, and in other situations. There are many piyutim that are written in Ladino as well. In any case, so he learned Spanish to help connect with the Jewish community in Salonika because it also reflects a much broader vision of what he had planned for what would become the Jewish state. He did not want to create a Jewish state for the Ashkenazi Jewish communities. That wasn't his goal. Because every community we talked about pretty much, and all the history we've talked about, has been from the more or less until not we go back to the time of when we did the Golden Age of Spain. But since then, most of it is focused on the things that are happening in Eastern Europe and the pogroms and all these and the emancipation and Haskalah, all that. He saw Israel as a refuge for everybody, not Ashkenazim, not Sephardim, Jews. I think we would do very well to remember that sometimes. When I first started coming to Israel, first to learn in yeshiva and then later on in life, especially when I came in the 70s, the majority of the country was at that time Ashkenazi. And there's a very, very derogatory term that was used by Sfaradim to describe the Ashkenazim. At that time, the Sfaradim were the minority. They were called, I don't think I've heard this term in 25 years. It's called vuzvuzim. Why were Ashkenazim called vuzvuzim? Because they heard the Yiddish speaking Ashkenazim who came from Europe. They wouldn't understand. They go vuz, meaning what? So they heard vuz, they came called vuzvuzim. And that was not something that was in the DNA whatsoever of Ben Gurion. He looked at Jews as Jews and not broken down by Sephardic or Ashkenazic culture or background. World War I breaks out in 1914, and Ben Gurion finished his studies, but the war would transform the political landscape in the Middle East and would have a direct effect on him, a direct effect on the Jews, and direct effect on what we will become known as the land of Israel. The Ottoman Empire entered the war on the side of Germany. So that created a very serious problem, or crisis is probably a better word, for the Zionist movement. Because remember that the Jews are trying to make this push for Jews to come to Israel, to live in Israel. And it's under the Ottoman rule. And now the Turks have taken sides with Germany. So it becomes a problem for the Zionist movement. And one of the first things that Ottomans do, I guess the first thing, but one of them they do, is they expel foreign nationals from Palestine. Among the, and also many of the people of the Second Aliyah, the pioneers, held Russian citizenship, and they made them enemy aliens. So Ben Gurion tries to advocate for Jews to enlist in the Ottoman army. This is a harbinger of something that's going to happen with the British army a few years from in a short time, we'll see. But he tries to advocate for Jews to join the Ottoman army because he believed that if the Jews would show their service and their loyalty, it would earn them some credit with the Ottoman Empire and potentially some national rights in the land of Palestine. But when that failed, he himself was deported. He was deported in 1915. And you might have thought, if you don't know anything about Ben Gurion, that he went back to Europe. And you would be wrong. He actually went to the United States. And he had reason to do that because he felt that the United States did not go through what Eastern Europe did as far as pogroms. There's a different culture, a different history, a different background. And he felt maybe it was a ripe community or country to start becoming who he eventually becomes. He's not an unknown. He's still a mover and a shaker, but he's still pretty far down on the totem pole. By the way, parenthetically, that's a misnomer. The further down on the totem pole you are, the more important historically in Indian culture, American Indian, not in India Indians. That we always said, oh, he's a low man on the totem pole, but that was really a good thing. The higher on the totem pole, you were actually lower in status. So if you don't know anything about Ben Gurion, at least you'll learn that. Anyways, so he arrives in New York in 1915. I guess that's part of the United States. And he spends 3 years trying to organize American Jews. He, again, if this were just a course on Ben Gurion, we'd literally be spending the next few months talking about him and all the details, but he goes anywhere from, he vacillates anything from being able to barely get together a minion, so to speak, for people to listen to him, to eventually being up, talking to packed houses, people hanging from the rafters to hear his talks. And he was definitely not, I can't say definitely wasn't. He was not a narcissist, but he had certain qualities that you might think he would be. And that showed sometimes in how he would report about his speeches and the attendance at some of his places. He married in the United States. He married a nurse that he met in New York. Her name was Paula Munweis. And their marriage would stay until he died in 1968. Now, they're buried together. We know that they're buried in Sde Boker. It's not Sde Boker. Sde Boker. Sde Boker. Boker is a cowboy, a ranch hand, one who deals with bakar, not really a cowboy, but one who deals with cattle. Boker is morning. Boker is a cow herder, however you want to say it in English. In any case, there were two massive strains on their marriage. Probably each one could be an entire class, but I'll just say it in one sentence. The first strain, which is pretty obvious, was the entire single-minded devotion that Ben Gurion had to Zionism. It took over his life. Every moment of his life was about Zionism. He eventually, when he's in Israel, I'm just kind of jumping forward for a minute, he has a tiny little place that's all about books and books and books and books and books. It's all about books and Zionism. So the one thing that he had this single-minded vision about Zionism was one thing that's put a strain on their marriage because he was an unavailable husband and father. The other was that from the time he was in Poland until the day he died. He loved another woman. There was another woman in his life. She did not. They never did end up getting married, and Paula was well aware of this other woman. Makes for very interesting reading if you want to read the many biographies that are out there. Like I mentioned last week, I did read one very large biography last year. So these are putting massive strains on the marriage. It almost did end multiple times. She gets Paula, his wife, gets sick, and the kids almost all kinds of medical issues, and he's not around. And she's pining away from him. We've got to come back. So again, if this interests you, I really do encourage you to go read it online. You can find a biography and learn more about that. But I don't want to veer into that right now because this is not a love story right now. We got to get into. But Paula would eventually follow him from the United States back to Palestine and raise their three children there alone, pretty much, because he traveled, he organized. If you go back to Herzl, we talk about also a little bit about Weizmann. Part of what they did was they acted as ambassadors for pre-state Israel, trying to get money and funding and political support and all this other. He did the same thing, but more than just getting political support and funding, he was trying to get Jews, trying to sell the idea of Zionism. Because his goal, of course, was to create a home that would be both a refuge and a base of operations. I'm using that in quotes for his work, his Zionist ideas. He witnessed in the United States a Jewish community that was largely prosperous and largely uninterested in Zionism. It was not like you had people saying like, prayer for the welfare of the state of Israel, or obviously it didn't exist yet. It was more common to find a prayer in Russia for the Tsar, and then for the Tsarina, and for the president of the United States in the United States. But the idea of praying for the welfare for Israel, even though, again, it's not a state yet, Zionism was not on the American agenda back then. Sometimes it's hard to say it's on the American agenda today, but it's definitely more so today than it was back in the early 1900s. Most American Jews, so if they're not focused on Zionism, they're not thinking about, we need a refuge. First of all, it's not like they don't know what's going on in Europe. They do know. They're well aware of the massacres that had taken place. Anything back in the 1600s with Khmelnytsky all the way up to the early 1900s. We're going to talk about Hebron a little bit in a few minutes. So what are they involved in? In the United States, they're focused on a story that's repeating itself over time, and that is trying to integrate into the society into which they have come. There is not yet a massive influx of Jews from Eastern Europe to the United States. It's starting, but it's not as big as it will become. But just like whether it was in Hungary or it was in Poland or it was in Germany, the Jews tried to blend in because for one reason, socially and financially. The other is the misguided belief that the more you blended in, the less chance that there'll be anti-Semitism. Try telling that to the Hungarian Jews, the last victims of the Holocaust. I will make a recommendation if you have not seen it. There's a movie it won all kinds of Academy Awards, as far as I know. It's called Sunshine. It's about the Sonnenschein. It's a mythical family, Sonnenschein family in Hungary, who believed they were Hungarian first and Jews second, and how what was happening, and they knew what was happening in Germany and in Poland and other places, was not going to touch them in Hungary because various reasons. And it follows three generations of the Sonnenschein family become Sunshine. And it's a magnificent movie. When we do eventually get to the period of pre-Holocaust, Holocaust studies, I'll probably be making lots of recommendations on either books or articles or movies, whatever it might be. And for those of you who have visited Israel, and those of you who are living here in Israel, if you have not been either ever or in the last many, many years to Yad Vashem, and the last thing you remember Yad Vashem is its old building and its old way it was run, you're in for I can't say a pleasant surprise. You can't say anything pleasant about the Holocaust, but you can say you'll be seeing a totally different type of museum than the old museum many, many years ago. Anyways, I don't want to get to veer off into that. So again, the Jew, what, it's not that you had Jews were like um, apathetic to Israel. It just wasn't really on their agenda. They were too busy trying to be Americans. You know, they needed the cars, they needed the business, they needed the society, they need all these things in the clubs and money. So Ben Gurion works tirelessly. Sorry. He works tirelessly to recruit volunteers for something he calls the Jewish Legion. He is one of the things that Ben Gurion was a master at was long-term planning and vision. He was a man of a chazon. Good word if you don't know it in Hebrew. Chazon is a vision. For example, it's the first word in Sefer Yeshayahu. The Shabbat prior to Tisha B'Av was called Shabbat Chazon because of Yeshayahu's vision. Chazon Yeshayahu at the beginning of Sefer Yeshayahu. So he had Chazon. And he understood that it wasn't just a matter of, okay, we need to try and move all the Jews to Israel. He also understood that they would have to be not just farmers, not just knowing how to be shmata peddlers and all these. Remember, the farmers, that's the Rav Mohilever, who got all this idea of teaching agriculture to the Jews. But they also had to know how to defend themselves. They had this idea in his head of a nascent army. It's not the IDF. It's not any of that yet. It's not the Haganah. It's not the Palmach. Nothing yet. There's nothing like that yet. At least not physically. Maybe it's here. And he tried to recruit, and he did. He recruited volunteers for what becomes known as the Jewish Legion. It would eventually join the British Army when there was a war to conquer, when they tried to conquer Palestine and take it from the Ottomans. The idea of Jewish soldiers fighting for the liberation of Eretz Yisrael had very significant meaning, not just to Ben Gurion, but it was the message he was trying to make sure he could broadcast, especially in the United States, because for 2,000 years, since the Bar Kokhba revolt in approximately year 130, 132 of the Common Era, Jews had not fought for their own land. So you're talking about little less than 2,000 years that we didn't do it. So that the Jewish Legion in Ben Gurion's mind, this group of fighters, and again, how are he trained and all that is not important for tonight. It represented the rebirth not only of the idea of Zionism, but the rebirth of Jewish military power. So if you know even a modicum of history, you know that eventually the British do conquer the land of Palestine. And, you know, the old saying, was it good for the Jews or bad for the Jews? The answer is yes. But I want to show you first one of three videos. We're going to look at a few sentences on a couple things. They're each going to kind of flip back and forth between these videos. Get this here to share. First thing I'm going to look at is General Allenby entering the Holy City. This is a colorized version. This was originally shot in black and white. I'm just going to show like a minute or so of this, and they'll explain the significance and what that meant for Ben Gurion as well. And for this one, I'm not going to have the sound on because it's just like crackling. There's no words. See, this is like Allenby is entering the Holy City, accompanied. He doesn't go in, as the legend is, he would not go in on his horse. He felt he had to walk in to his Shar Yafo here, and he's walking in behind this man here. We'll see him in a second. Over here. There's General Allenby walking in, symbolically taking control of the old city of Jerusalem. Now, if you're familiar with the street named Allenby, the Allenby Crossing, it's all named after him. This moment had profound impact on David Ben Gurion when General Allenby captures Jerusalem, Yerushalayim, December 1917, which means that it's going to be 110 years next December. Not this coming December, the next one. Wow. Amazing. Because it became the beginning of a new era. Again, good for the Jews, not good for the Jews. We know that for some reason, for some it's horrific for the Jews, for some it becomes good for the Jews. We're going to see just like little snippets of it tonight. Like the Balfour Declaration, for example, is only issued 1 month, had only been issued a month earlier, and it had committed the British government to support the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. That, said Ben Gurion, believed, as did many others, was the greatest diplomatic achievement since the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash. It was on that par. Now, I do want to show you the next video. This will have sound. Oh, you don't see my grandson. I need to see. Share. And not this. Let's see. This is a 3-minute video. I'm not going to give it any setup other than to tell you it's with someone named Jacob Rothschild. Put the sound and make this small.
Dear Lord Rothschild, I have much pleasure in conveying to you, on behalf of His Majesty's government, the following declaration of sympathy with Jewish Zionist aspirations, which has been submitted to and approved by the Cabinet.
Why was it that this letter was sent by the Foreign Secretary to your great-uncle Walter?
It's an interesting question because it was primarily a movement from Eastern Europe, but they didn't clarify who was in charge of that movement.
So I'm going to stop you for just a second and make sure it's very clear what he just said. We have to understand, why is it that Lord Rothschild was the recipient of the Balfour Declaration, which we'll talk about more in depth, but right now this is just how it ties into Ben Gurion. Because there's no official leader of the Zionist movement. Yes, you have Ben Gurion, you have Kalischer, you have all these different names that we've talked about, but like, who's the recipient? Who's going to be the recipient? So the question to him, who this is the nephew of the Rothschild that received the letter, why him? So he said there was no official, so why him? We'll see.
And in addition, it was after all in Great Britain. So they felt that the Rothschild family should be the one to whom it was addressed. And Walter was Lord Rothschild, and he was a Zionist. And those really are the background reasons.
So Walter received the Balfour Declaration, and I have a copy here. And I wonder if I could possibly ask you to read it for us.
Yes, indeed. Yeah. I'm going to put on my spectacles to make sure I read it accurately. His Majesty's government view with favour the establishment of Palestine as a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavours to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. I should be grateful if you would bring this declaration to the knowledge of the Zionist Federation.
Okay, again, he said that, okay, I'm addressing this to you, to Lord Rothschild. There's another minute or so on this we're going to see. But make sure you pass the message along. It's like, okay, this is like a really historical document. This is a massive thing. Bring it to their attention.
Yours, Arthur Balfour.
And here it is, the Balfour Declaration. What do you feel when you see it here?
I genuinely feel it's one of the most extraordinary moments in the history of the Jewish people. If you think it took 3,000 years to get to this, and then you say, how did this miracle happen? It's the most incredible piece of opportunism. I mean, if you think you had an impoverished would-be scientist, Chaim Weizmann, who somehow gets to England, meets a few people, including members of my family, seduces them. He has such great charm and conviction. He gets to Balfour, and he unbelievably persuades Balfour and Lloyd George, the Prime Minister, and most of the ministers, that this idea of the national home for Jews should be allowed to take place. I mean, it's so unlikely. And then he's, starts to fight a difficult battle with the British cabinet, and this letter goes through 5 drafts, as you know. And in the end, it comes out as a rather compromising letter. I mean, the essential point is there for the Jewish community to fasten on to. You have the first bit, which promises a national home rather than the national home, and then you have the bit that nothing that's to be done should in any way harm the Arab community. But you come back to the big point, which is that this is perhaps the greatest event in Jewish life.
Okay. So I think that's what's very significant here is not just the document itself, which is the most significant part, but is that most people don't even realize that it didn't get sent to the Jewish people themselves. It was a Jewish person. It was Lord Rothschild that received it. But it wasn't the Zionist entity, which is a terrible way to say that because it's how our enemies call us. It wasn't a person that the British government saw as the representative of the Zionist movement, which is amazing. So again, Ben Gurion and others, of course, referred to that as the most diplomatic achievement since the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash. A great power, which at that time was Great Britain, England was a great power in the world. Now, I'll leave the politics out. Had officially recognized the Jewish people's right to a country, which is, first of all, the United Nations today, if the November 29th vote of 1947 would go through, it would fail. If the British were asked to say recognize a country for the Jews, it would fail. Everything is timing. I asked one time, I said, had a discussion with a friend who's brilliant genius when it comes to politics and geopolitical information. I said, I don't understand something. That you look around the Middle East and these countries, Kuwait and Saudi Arabia and Iran and Iraq and billions and billions of barrels of oil and oil reserves and all, and tiny little Israel. Why couldn't there be some oil wells here? So he looked at me and he said, I have a very simple answer. I said, well, I'd love to hear it. He said, can you imagine it's May 14th, 1948. Do you think the British would have pulled out of Israel had there been massive oil fields here? Not a chance. They'd be sitting literally on a gold mine. So it wouldn't have happened. So Hashem, let there not be gold oil reserves for the most part, but at least we have natural gas. We have a lot of that. So that's great. We can sell that to other countries. In any case, so again, it's this massive achievement, a political achievement, and it is an emboldening move that now people like Ben Gurion and others are able to use to bolster the idea. We really need to come back and move to Israel. We need to have this concept of Aliyah grow. He comes back to Palestine in 1918, which is now under British military administration. And in the meantime, from the time he left to the time he's a few years, the whole Jewish politics, the landscape of Jewish politics vis-a-vis the host country, the host this time is the British, has changed dramatically. The very small, tiny yeshuv of the second Aliyah is being transformed by new immigrants, new institutions, new conflicts, of course. And the mandate period, this time period, which officially began in 1920 and ends May 14th, 1948, it was called Mandatory Palestine, the British Mandate. There would be multiple tensions that would be going on almost at all times. Tension between Jews and Arabs, between the Zionist movement and the British administration, and within the Jewish community itself, because the different opinions of how this country should look, what it should be doing, what should be happening. Ben Gurion's primary focus at this point, while he's in Israel and he has people coming, is building of institutions, literally and figuratively. He understood that before there could be a Jewish state, there had to be the infrastructure, the tashtit, that's the Hebrew word for it, the infrastructure of statehood. In other words, just to declare, okay, we're going to plant a flag. We're a Jewish state. We're going to call it whatever it's going to be called. Here we go. Okay, great. we need a concept of what kind of government do we want. Do you want something like the United States, which has a two-party system? Do you want a parliamentary system? Do we want a bicameral house? All these different things but they had to have the institute. They had to have government, like quasi-governmental offices already in place. That when there will be a state one day. Now, obviously, Ben Gurion doesn't know that May 14th, 1948 is going to be the date of the state. This is still 20 plus years earlier. But he's already building the foundation for it. He felt that the infrastructure of the state needed labor unions, political parties, agricultural settlements, a defense force, obviously, and above all, which was very difficult, probably the most difficult of all unified political leadership. We've seen here in modern times in Israel that the government, in times of crises, forms a unity government, which means instead of having the majority, and when we talk about modern state Israel, we'll talk about the political system and compare and contrast, so to speak, to a democratic system that's not a parliamentary system. Now, how does it work? The parties and the balloting, and you vote for a party, you don't vote for a person. For some of you, this is alphabet, and for other of you, you're very confused. But I'll give a class on that. I've actually taught that before in school. But in any case, we've seen in our own day, like at the beginning of this war, that a national unity government comes into effect, which means instead of having the majority and the opposition, which is the minority, they came together for, I think it was 14 or 15 minutes. That was a little bit longer than that. But it was critical. There's always infighting. There's always, and by the way, disagreements and fighting, and that's fine. There's really nothing wrong with it when it's done the right way, when there's still respect, when there's still everyone's voice should be heard. I mean, talking about a democracy. Obviously, when it comes into chaos and physical fighting and destruction and all that's terrible. In 1920, he becomes the Secretary General of the Histadrut. I mentioned that name last week, the Histadrut, the General Federation of Jewish Workers in Palestine. That was a mouthful. That was what it was called in English. And under his leadership, the Histadrut becomes much more than just a trade union. The way it was originally envisioned, the Histadrut will be a union for workers. But what ends up happening with him is it becomes a co-op enterprise. He provides health care through what become known as Kupot Cholim, they tried to change the name. It's still, to this day, still, as far as I know, it doesn't stick. The history of having Mu'uchedet and Klalit and all the different health funds go all the way back to the early 20s, the beginning of the Histadrut, that there would be the concept of socialized medicine, and people buy into the fund, and they would be able to pay a smaller amount of money for the care. The Histadrut created schools, it organized culture, it organized sports events. It almost became a state within a state, providing services to members that would normally be provided by a government. So what happens is, part of Ben Gurion's long-term dream, it's not even a dream, it's a vision, was that you're getting everything set up so that when the day actually does come, that there can be a state, they're ready to go. They don't have to start from scratch. No, there's no concept yet of what kind of political government actually would be, but all these different services and different institutions, the foundation's already being laid at this point. The Histadrut embodied Ben Gurion's socialist Zionism, but it was pragmatic. It was tachlis oriented because people needed these things, and it was open to all Jewish workers. Didn't make a difference their political affiliation, their religious, that had absolutely nothing to do with it. And throughout, what Ben Gurion was really doing also for himself, he's building a power base that eventually allows him to dominate the Zionist movement. Lahavdil, in the United States, Jimmy Hoffa, the president of the AFL-CIO, I still remember the headline in the Chicago Sun-Times, "Where's Hoffa?" Maybe he's on the end zone of the 49ers or something. I don't know. But he was probably one of the most powerful people in the United States while he was alive. Ben Gurion was probably the most powerful man in Mandate Palestine. and in the political venue and besides beyond the political venue. He was not the most charismatic speaker. He wasn't the most beloved leader, but he was the most persistent. He was the most organized. He was probably the most ruthlessly practical, the one with the massive meta vision of what he saw would become the land of Israel. In the 20s and 30s, the Jewish community starts to grow dramatically, especially after the rise of Nazism. People start emigrating from Europe to Israel because people, not unfortunately enough, saw the writing on the wall. They saw that things were getting bad, worse and worse for the Jews. Where have I heard that recently, lately? I don't know. And they understood that they had to get out of Dodge. The third, fourth, and fifth Aliyot, which if you remember, when we first started talking about Zionism, and there were multiple waves of Aliyah. They were called, for lack of another term or title, the third Aliyah, the fourth Aliyah, the fifth Aliyah, which spanned over a number of years, brought hundreds of thousands of Jews to Palestine. They established new agricultural settlements, i.e. kibbutzim, built cities, for example, from sand dunes like Tel Aviv. I'm sure you've all seen the famous picture of taking the lottery, the first, I don't remember how many plots of land in 1919 on the sand dune that becomes eventually Tel Aviv. We talked about where the name came from. We already did that. Through the actions of Eliezer ben Yehuda, which we talked about him 2 weeks ago, I think. Yeah, 2 weeks ago. The Hebrew is being used throughout the country, and he helps to create, he meaning Ben Gurion, helps to create a vibrant Jewish life, cultural life, economic life. But this growth came with more conflict. Where's this main conflict? Not internal, but once again, external. We say it on the night of the Seder, Pesach, that every generation there are people who want to destroy us. The Arabs, logically, were opposed to Zionism. I shouldn't say it in the past tense, but still are. I'm talking about this time period of history. And as the Jewish population continued to grow, their opposition got stronger and stronger. There were riots in 1920, 1921, and the most devastating in 1929, including Hebron, where the Arabs rioted and killed 67 Jews in Hebron, destroying an ancient community. It was particularly traumatic. If you have not been to the museum there, if you've not visited the cemetery there, if you're not a Kohen, I can't recommend it enough. It is a it's something that you need to read and hear about, and to see, to be by that cemetery. As a parenthetical comment, I've had many people ask me personally if I've been down to the Nova area, if I've been down to Be'eri and others, and I can't go yet. Maybe 10 years or 20 years from now, but I can't personally go. But going to the site of the place where the Jews were massacred at Hebron, I guess because we're still a number of generations removed from it, but I did actually have somewhat of an indirect connection. There were actually people from Chicago who were learning in Hebron at the time. There is a shul in Chicago, Anshe Matala. The rabbi, Alav Shalom, one of the first ones, was Rabbi Menachem Mendel Goodman. And Rabbi Menachem Mendel Goodman was a survivor of that massacre. And he ends up going to Chicago for various reasons. He ends up being the rabbi of the shul. And I davened there for a number of years while he was still the rabbi. And I didn't even know his background until someone says, you know, he survived the Hebron massacre. So I said, nope, did not know that. So what I do want us to do the last couple minutes here is I want to share one more short video. It's in Hebrew, but it has English subtitles. Here. What was that? Here it is. Okay. Make this big. So again, it is in Hebrew with English subtitles.
בשבת בבוקר, מוקדם בבוקר, כבר הייתה הרגשה של אסון עומד להתרחש. ראינו את הערבים נכנסים לתוך מכוניות, נוסעים בדרכם לכיוון ירושלים, ובצעקות עליהם ונטבח אל יהוד, פירוש עליהם והבה ונשחט את היהודים ועוד מיני צעקות כאלה שהלהיבו את עצמם בצעקות האלה.
بدايتها زي ما تقول
Keep in mind, the man who's speaking now was an Arab.
هذول اللي في الخليل قالوا انه هذول اليهود بدهم يعني يستولوا على بلادنا ويطردونا، والدعاية هذه كانت تجي من طرف الحكومة وأخذت فكر الناس إنه صحيح هذا، وهو مش صحيح، هو تقريبا بس توهيم للشعب عشان يهيج الشعب.
Now keep in mind, what he doesn't talk about it here, but one of the things they were told is the Jews are trying to stampede and take over Al-Aqsa Mosque. Again, history just repeats itself over and over and over. We had it at the time of Sharon, we had it recently with the Al-Aqsa flood. So.
وهذا كان خطأ من اللي زرع هالشيء. اللي عنده مخ عاقل في الخليج كله ما كانش في وارده هذا الشيء. العقال، أما الأولاد الصغار الجهال هذا كلهم شو بيعرفش.
מוסתים, מרוגשים, נרגזים, התנפלו על היישוב היהודי בלי שום התחשבות, הרגו, שחטו, עינו גדול וקטן, צעיר וזקן, ילד ואישה, בלי שום התחשבות, בלי שום הבחנה. אנחנו בבית אבי גרנו במרחק לא רב מבית אחי במעלה גבעה, ובינינו היה שדה ריק. מהחלונות של ביתנו אפשר היה לראות את הבית של אחי ואת המדרגות המובילות לאותו הבית, והרצח שם היה גדול ואכזרי.
I'm not getting into the details of the actual massacre. If you're interested, find out. You can read online. It starts off in the Beit Midrash. One guy was sitting and learning Erev Shabbat, and then it goes from house to house to house, and the slaughter, and it was horrific. And there's this, like I said, there's a cemetery there you can visit. And if you go to Hebron, it is definitely worth visiting the cemetery. Again, if you're not a Kohen, I guess you can stand outside. Part of where we've come from and how far we've come since then, and how we are still in somewhat the same position in some cases. Okay, so Bezrat Hashem next week, my plan is I'm going to finish just a little bit more about Ben Gurion, and then I'm going to do a bit of a summary. I'm going to go back to all these personalities you talked about, kind of put it together as a package, whether it's the socialist Zionism, the religious Zionism, not from Herzl, but Mohilever and Reines and Pinsker and all these, kind of put it together one unit before we move on. And that'll be for Bezrat Hashem next week as of now, the regular night on Tuesday night. And hope to see you all there, and have a wonderful evening.